Happening now, the last ships from China bringing cargo unaffected by President Trump's massive new tariffs are sailing into American ports. So that means the countdown to supply shortages and rising prices has officially begun.
Brian, it's very similar to March 2020, right? I don't want to say panic buying, but it's a little bit of concern buying ahead of the unknown of the price changes that are really changing every day.
It started with a contradiction. In April, the Port of Los Angeles celebrated its busiest month in years. By late May, incoming shipments had collapsed by 35%, and 1 in 4 cargo vessels vanished from the schedule. Truckers were sent home. Bonded warehouses hit 100% capacity. And yet, Washington doubled down, pushing tariffs as high as 145% on critical imports. JP Morgan now warns of a $50 billion GDP loss, not over a year, but this quarter. Retailers say they have just 5 to 7 weeks of inventory before shelves thin out. So here's the question no one dares to ask. What if this isn't just a disruption? What if we're counting down to the first intentional shutdown of America's economic arteries? Number 5, the 5 to 7 week timer. Early signs suggest the clock is already ticking. When Port of LA Chief Gene Soroka warned that retailers hold only 5 to 7 weeks of full inventory, executives first shrugged until they ran the math. Big box chains burnt through 42 days of stock during the 2020 lockdown panic. Today, with container arrivals down 35%, that buffer could evaporate even faster. Inside a Midwest distribution hub, forklifts now zigzag through half-empty aisles. One manager whispered that reorder queues for holiday toys are 60 days behind schedule. Translation: parents may find empty pegs where action figures should be, and that scarcity snowballs. Wholesalers, spooked by tariff spikes as high as 145%, are slashing purchase orders, betting they can't move goods once sticker shock hits. Meanwhile, freight forwarders report a surge in panic premium contracts. Importers pay an extra $1,000 per container just to leapfrog the backlog. Yet, vessel counts keep sliding. In week 22 alone, only 6 ships berthed at the country's busiest gateway, half the pre-tariff average. If this trend continues, September shelves could mirror late March 2020, gaps in cereal, printers, even antibiotics. But there's a darker twist. Unlike the pandemic, no relief ships wait offshore, because producers from Shenzhen to Monterrey are rerouting around the United States entirely. As one logistics analyst put it, we're watching the supply chain bleed out in real time, and the tourniquet is policy. So the next question writes itself. When the 42-day sandglass runs dry, does Main Street tighten its belt? Or will Wall Street trigger the first wave of recession-grade layoffs? Number 4, freight rate surge and the tariff wall. It started with the number 145%. That's the tariff rate slapped onto some Chinese imports after April 9th. At first, many believed it was a bluff. Then came the shipping data. Freight rates from Shanghai to Los Angeles surged 16% in 1 week. From Shanghai to New York, they jumped 19%. Spot quotes for a single 40-foot container climbed above $4,300. And just like that, the invisible cost of global trade became very real. Importers are now paying double or walking away. According to JP Morgan, imports from China could fall by as much as 75 to 80% this year. Not because of war, not because of weather, but because the cost to do business has become unsustainable. Retailers and wholesalers are being forced into brutal decisions. Pay up, pass the cost to customers, or cancel the shipment. It's already showing. In early May, Ford raised sticker prices on several Mexican-built models by $2,000, blaming tariffs. General Motors expects up to $5 billion in tariff-related losses this year. Target warns of higher produce prices. Electronics, toys, and school supplies are next. But here's the danger. When goods get too expensive, demand shrinks. When demand shrinks, production slows. And when production slows, layoffs begin. What began as a price fight on imported goods is now threatening a cascade of job cuts across logistics, retail, and manufacturing. And yet, despite the fallout, some insiders believe this is just phase one. One analyst warned, "We haven't even seen what happens when retaliatory tariffs kick in. If this trend holds, July could bring not just higher prices, but a second tariff wave that triggers shortages not by accident but by design." Number 3. Warehouses jam, factories idle. It wasn't supposed to collapse this fast. Just months ago, companies raced to stockpile goods ahead of tariff deadlines. But by late May, the warehouses were full and the factory lines started going dark. Over 1,700 bonded warehouses across the U.S. are now at full capacity. That's not a slowdown. That's gridlock. Rental rates for storage space have quadrupled. Some logistics firms report wait lists of up to 6 months just to get access to a holding facility. In the words of one freight operator, the system's locked up and there's nowhere left to park the pain. On the manufacturing side, the cracks are widening. Automakers are pausing assembly lines, not because of a strike, but because parts never arrived. Just-in-time manufacturing, once celebrated as peak efficiency, has now become a fatal weakness. With key components stuck in customs or rerouted to avoid U.S. ports, plants in cities like Toledo and Chattanooga are idling entire shifts. Even when cargo does arrive, there's no place to put it. U.S. Customs and Border Protection is overwhelmed with emergency requests to authorize more bonded storage, but the backlog stretches into late summer. One executive in Southern California described the situation bluntly: "We're not moving goods anymore, we're triaging." This isn't a hiccup, it's a chain reaction. And for smaller manufacturers already squeezed by input costs rising 5.5% this year, the next step isn't creative accounting. It's layoffs. If this stagnation holds through July, we may see the return of 2020-style shutdowns, but this time not from a virus, from a colder move. Economic gridlock engineered by policy, enforced by paperwork, and spreading from port to payroll. So, what happens when the engine of American industry loses all pressure? Does it stall quietly or explode? Number 2, litigation lightning and the geopolitical knife edge. Early signs suggest the tariff war is about to jump from balance sheets to courtrooms and maybe battle maps. A coalition of 12 state attorneys general has filed suit against the White House, accusing President Trump of abusing emergency powers to impose sweeping duties without congressional consent. In their brief, they argue the International Emergency Economic Powers Act was never meant to underwrite a 145% tariff barrage. Overnight, a trade dispute has morphed into a constitutional knife fight. Washington's legal team calls the case grandstanding, but Wall Street isn't laughing. Investors know that a court-ordered freeze could leave imports stranded in limbo, igniting another spike in freight rates just as inventories hit the danger zone. Meanwhile, governors in port-reliant states, California, New York, South Carolina, warn that every week of uncertainty drains millions from local payrolls. Across the Atlantic, Brussels is drafting its own response. EU officials are openly discussing a retaliatory tariff of up to 50% on a basket of U.S. exports: aerospace parts, bourbon, even Midwestern soybeans. One diplomat called it an economic deterrent parked on America's doorstep. If enacted, Gulf and East Coast ports could see volumes plunge by double digits, gutting the last healthy arteries of the supply chain. This legal and political pincer leaves corporate America cornered. Comply with tariffs that may be overturned, or delay orders and risk empty shelves. Either choice writes red ink. If judges side with the states, the tariff wall could crack overnight, triggering a sudden flood of backlog cargo that chokes already jammed warehouses. But if the administration prevails and Europe retaliates, a two-front trade war could slash growth far deeper than $50 billion. Which verdict arrives first? And does it save the patient or stop the heartbeat? Number 1, global fracture and the dark fleet fuel squeeze. The supply chain slowdown is no longer just an American story, it's metastasizing across oceans. Sanctions have knocked over 10% of the world's tanker fleet out of legal service, birthing a shadow fleet that hauls Russian crude under flags of convenience. Insurance underwriters have blacklisted hundreds of vessels. Legitimate carriers now refuse to sail certain routes, and freight premiums on the remaining tankers have doubled since March. Energy executives warn that one well-timed incident in the Red Sea or Baltic could send oil prices, not barrels, spiking overnight. Meanwhile, Europe's own lifelines are tightening. Port congestion in Bremen has jumped 77% since late April. Antwerp and Hamburg are not far behind. Low Rhine water levels and a shortage of barge crews mean containers sit for days, sometimes weeks, before moving inland. And just when EU logistics managers thought it couldn't get worse, the White House threatened a 50% tariff on European exports starting June 1st. Brussels is already drafting payback. On NATO's northern flank, Russia says it will escort dark fleet tankers through the Baltic Sea to protect them from inspection. That pledge turns shipping lanes into a geopolitical tripwire. One collision, one misread radar ping, and insurance markets already on edge could freeze. If crude supply tightens while U.S. retail inventories bottom out, fuel surcharges will cascade through trucking, farming, even commercial aviation. Analysts call this the domino zone, a moment when small disruptions trigger disproportionate damage. One maritime strategist put it bluntly, we're a single block channel away from synchronized recession. So, the final question looms. When the world's cargo highways seize from oil to avocados, does national security step in with wartime controls, or do markets simply run out of oxygen first? America's countdown once measured cargo arrivals, now it measures patience. Ports idle, warehouses burst, and a lawsuit in Washington could detonate either a flood or a famine of imports overnight. Yet the real twist may come from the sea. One stray tanker incident in the Baltic or Red Sea could shove oil to triple digits, making diesel scarcer than toys on Black Friday. If that happens while inventories hit empty, the White House will face a dilemma unseen since World War II: impose emergency price controls on ration freight, or watch a policy-driven supply shock ricochet from grocery aisles to voting booths. So ask yourself, when the next ship fails to dock and the last gallon of cheap fuel vanishes, does the nation pivot to crisis footing? Or discover just how much economic oxygen has already escaped?